Hello and welcome to the Embodied Way Podcast. Conversations about our body's intelligence and coming back to our senses. I'm Stefana Serafina. Thanks for joining. And on today's episode, I speak to international educator, researcher, and author, Dr. Ruby Gibson, a somatic pioneer who for the last 35 years has been bridging bodywork, transpersonal psychology, human behavior, shamanism, and spirituality into a unique technique that she developed called somatic archaeology. At the center of her doctoral work and research have been transgenerational healing and recovery, primarily through the body's unique wisdom and intelligence. She is also the executive director of a nonprofit she co-founded, Freedom Lodge, providing historical trauma healing to Native American populations. And today I find her in her office in South Dakota. Dr. Ruby, welcome to the Embodied Way Podcast. I'm really excited to have you with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for accepting my invitation to join me here today for a conversation about the simple and complex way of body knowing and this fascinating body of work that you've developed about body intelligence that you call somatic archaeology. And you describe that as the process of curing our historical amnesia and remembering our stories, our cultural, our familial stories that are layered in our bodies, much in the same way that geological information is layered in the core of our earth. And this notion is fascinating and also deeply resonant. And I wonder, what would you say is at the center, at the heart of your discovery and your work with somatic archaeology? And how would you describe it to someone who is not familiar with not only the concept of somatic archaeology, but perhaps with the notion of body intelligence altogether?
Well, I think our bodies are very benevolent, and they have the ability and capacity to store all sorts of information. And when we look at our body as an ally, we can recognize it as a library, as a walking library. And a lot of times we avoid what's in that library that we're holding because maybe some of the information we don't want to remember or is too painful, consequently developing amnesia around it. Or the story that we've been told is different than the story that we feel, and we experience conflicts. Biological conflicts or moral conflicts about the information that we're holding. So we just push it aside and we attempt to think our way through problems instead of feel our way through problems. And it's really a loss of instinct, and a loss of relationship to the earth. So the book that I wrote is called My Body, My Earth, The Practice of Somatic Archaeology. And we create a relationship between our body and the earth in many unique ways that really helps us to identify where we're fragmented. And, the earth basically teaches us how to excavate ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And you have a very rich and profound language that you have developed around these concepts. So I'd really love to bring some of it in right here and read a bit from your book you just mentioned. And because I imagine some of our listeners may not be familiar with the term somatic, I'd like to say that somatic is that which relates to the body and is of the body, from the ancient Greek word soma. And in your book, you talk about our bodies as record keepers and storytellers, and we're going to come back to this in a minute, but you say, our bodies, like Earth, are the keepers of memory. Just like the earth contains the historical library of life in its ruins, graves, trees, rocks, and oceans, our bodies inherit the archives of our ancestors in their cells, muscles, blood, and bones. When we wish to examine how we evolved as a culture and a species, we dig in the earth to examine how each of us evolved as individuals or as family systems, and to explore the social and spiritual influences that have shaped us. We excavate our bodies. So you say excavate our bodies, unearth our bodies.
Yeah, the language is a little bit different, but it takes us out of the context of medical terminology, and puts us into a more organic relationship with what's happening through us and around us and in our circle of influence. So we identify a place where there's distress in the body. It might be an ache or a pain or a sensation of anxiety, maybe something that's chronic, or even repetitive injuries, repetitive traumas. Things that have happened to us, and we can clear away. It's like that place becomes the excavation site, right? So let's say you've had chronic back pain for 10 years. That's the place we want to excavate. And so we start by clearing away the top layer of stress, or just preparing our excavation site so we can really see what's going on. Because a lot of therapies deal with the surface stress, but they don't really see what's underneath that. And that's a common thing that we ask in somatic archaeology. What's under that? What's under that? What's under that? And so once we clear that excavation site, then we begin to dig. We begin to look for paths, for trails, for sensations that can give the body a voice and begin to speak to what's happening inside. These excavation sites can be very delicate, so we don't want to go in there with a backhoe and just start rearranging. We want to go very carefully with little brushes and little tools, because we might overlook a treasure. We might overlook something that is really powerful. Because typically in those kinds of holding patterns like that, what we're doing is protecting something very precious inside of us. Maybe our innocence, or maybe a balance or an internal sense of harmony that we then build all of this protection up around if we've experienced trauma or we've experienced, variety of things in our life. So we go slow and we go carefully. And at first, it can be a bit laborious, just attempting to get to what's in there. But then after that, it develops into a rhythm, and people get curious about what is under that. At first they don't want to know, and then they really want to know what's under it. And so we say that some people like to leave no stone unturned, and they want to dig all the way to the bottom.
Yes, and it sounds like what you're talking about is body symptoms that are present and become louder over time are actually just a reminder from the library of the body that there's something that needs to be tended to, or needs our attention. It's a call for attention. And you speak about our bodies as a record keeper and a storyteller. And there's a very interesting concept of the body remembering our history way beyond what our minds actually could remember, including the story of our generations, of our ancestors, of those in our families that we inherit and within whose blueprint we operate. So in your research and you... in your process of examination of those concepts and those processes, I'm curious, how have you found that the body remembers more than we could consciously remember? What is the body's process of remembering?
It's really all about how we store information, and that information can be stored according to a variety of different principles. And it's really culturally designed. So in the East, they might call it your chakra system. That might be how the library is organized. In other cultures, there's different references to it. But every culture has a religious or spiritual system that, helps to denote and to clarify the value and how we recognize that there's value in something. And so, we dig according to those outer models or whatever the belief system is of the person. But even if you don't have one, the process is a biological one. And there's really so much beauty inside of us that we can just call it, a beauty way. We can just say that we're looking for what's beautiful inside of us. And I really can't emphasize enough how benevolent our body is, and that healing is not a difficult thing when we approach our body in a way where we embrace it and make it an ally and become curious about what's happening. And we listen to the voice of our body, which is sensation. And when we stop and we begin to have that silent or nonverbal conversation, things change.
So why would you say that the body is a system that is intelligent in a different way and ultimately in a more profound way than the thinking and rational mind? How does the body remember more than the thinking self can?
Well, we have, the stories that we've been told, right? That's one form of inheritance. And then we have the stories that we hold within our system. And so typically, it's held within the hormonal system. So all of your endocrine system holds a variety of different pieces of information. And so we typically access that. And for most people in this day and age, you can simply draw your attention to the adrenal glands, because most people are in some state of fight or flight, dependent upon where they live and what's in their community. Here where I am in South Dakota, working with the Sioux Nation and the 9 tribes of South Dakota, the historical trauma here is very intense. So there's a lot of different ways that we have to adjust how we're tending to those parts, because so many systems inside the body have been exhausted by years and years of trauma and stress. So it really depends. We get that story about what's happened to our ancestors, but a lot of times that story is broken down, or that story protects the guilty, or the story is changed in order to make someone look better or feel better, or there are things that we're ashamed of, that we don't want to talk about. So those things get put aside.
Yes, and you speak to that kind of body memory as a generational memory, as the 7 generations that are still alive in our body. Mm-hmm. Right? And could you say more about that?
So we look at the epigenetic transfer. Okay, so we all know that we inherit genes, right? That's our DNA, and it tells us the color of our hair, the color of our eyes, the way that we look and feel. A lot of our behaviors come from our family system. And all of those things can define us. But the genetics are like the train that carries the information from my mother to myself to my daughter. That's one form. The epigenetic transfer is the behavioral, the survival, the creative, the essence of...
Perhaps emotional also, I imagine.
Oh, certainly. Mm-hmm. If we know, and this is an interesting way to look at it, but if we know that a woman was born with all of her eggs, right? Men produce sperm every day, but women are born with a certain number of eggs, and when those eggs are gone, they're done. So if that's true, then I was an egg in my mother's womb when she was in her mother's womb, because she was born with me, with the seed of me already inside of her when she was in her mother's womb. So our first experience is of life, of biological life, is in our grandmother's womb. So we can make that connection really easily. I don't know why it gets overlooked so much in, science or in therapeutic circles, but it's so present on a biological level. We then consider, what did grandmother go through? What was her life like? What were the things that were important to her? What were the things that stressed her? What was, happening in the world around her? And we know that most of our internal or subconscious responses, especially the survival-based ones, are going to be based on grandma's reality, particularly on the maternal side.
After all this time, they're still living in the library of the body.
Well, if the DNA is the train, then the epigenetics is the payload that train carries. Epi simply means on top of. So the epigenetics is what the train carries, generation to generation, and it goes through the women. All of that is tracked through women's bodies. And so it's, once we start to develop those relationships and we experience a symptom inside of us, we wonder, did mom experience the same thing? Did grandma experience the same thing? And then we know if there's some thread of connection, that what we're holding and experiencing today may be a remnant of grandma's experience just 2 generations forward.
And how would you say that applies to men?
Well, it applies to men in a little bit of a different way. It applies to the more external approach to life, like occupation. It might apply to certain behavioral standards. It may apply to, particularly to diet, and the ways in which we eat. They've done a lot of research on kind of what I call, we are what our ancestors ate. So if our ancestors experienced a famine, or, they've done a lot of research on hunger winter in the Netherlands, in Dutch, because they had a period of time where they weren't allowed any food. It was when the Nazis were occupying, and a lot of the next generations experienced significant changes, but a lot of the men or the boys experienced diabetes, issues around procreation and hormones. And so they start to track and look and see what happens when one generation doesn't get enough nutrients. Then how does that affect subsequent generations in the male? And then that affects the male sperm, which seeds the egg. So it's a really, there's so many details that you could look at the ways that were influenced by our ancestors. But I find the one that is probably most potent for all of us is the emotional or the epigenetic transfer, is what ends up creating the mold, so to speak, or the archetype of our own view of ourselves, about who we think we are and what we think is possible, what we think, why we're here and what we're meant to do.
Yes, and there's no doubt that our ancestral heritage lives within our bodies, and it creates the map, the blueprint within which we operate. But what is even more interesting to me, and which you really bring up a lot in your work, is that certainly our histories are kept within our bodies, but a lot of the times we have historical amnesia. That's what you call it, historical amnesia. And in a way, we're dissociated from the reality of how those stories are still alive in us and within us. And that's where the real work, that's what the work calls us to uncover those histories and those stories. And at some point in your book, you talk about it as a proverbial U-Haul of stories that we may be just dragging along without the conscious awareness that we could remember them and therefore heal them.
I believe it's the occupation of our generation to remember. I think that we have the resources and the capacity and the time to be able to begin to remember, because we're not simply remembering for ourselves. What we remember, we can potentially cure. And then that cure lightens the burden of the ancestors who've come before us, because they're, according to what I've seen and experienced, they're waiting for this generation to kind of clean up some things that they were unable to clean up. And then we're also lightening the load for the next 7 generations. And that's really important. So we look at it as a healing for 7 generations.
The body is a helper in this. It's a self-organizing intelligence that assists us in digging up, as you say, our stories, right? And to discover those hidden histories, we can just trust that the body can take us there. You speak to this, saying that the body takes us into those histories by using the breath, sound, and movement, which are some of the primary languages for the soma, right? So to those listeners whose curiosity has already been sparked, can they do this on their own? How do you do somatic excavation?
It's dependent upon your level of sobriety, your willingness to pay attention, and how engaged you are with your body. A lot of the things that we hold on to in our systems that cause us distress are emotional patterns. And fear is, of course, at the center of that. And so we cannot think our way out of fear, but we can feel our way out. So it has to be dependent on if that person is willing to go to what they're afraid of and to feel it inside and to let it move. Not everybody has that ability to be savvy around that if they haven't learned it from their parents or from their family system. If you grew up in a family where the body was always suppressed or overridden, or we thought our way through things instead of felt our way through, that's a real loss of connection to the earth. It moves us, out of a feeling into a thinking. It's simply very challenging to try and analyze everything and make sense of it. But when we know truth, it's because we feel it in our heart. Truth is really what we're looking for. So it's a heartfelt experience. And so if we go into our body and we start dropping into places and we don't feel resourced, or we don't have some support or some guidance or a cheerleader around us, then we're going to bring up information that could potentially cause us more distress. So, the idea is to bring it up, to let it go, not to have to sit with what the suffering that came before you or, that's coming next. We don't want to sit with that suffering. We want to bring it up and use our power, our imagery, our heart, our, prayer in order to transform that. But our system will transform it if we provide the right tools. And so it's development of that set of tools.
Yes, and perhaps these tools are best developed with some help, some additional support by, and even perhaps with some objective reflection by a peer or the support of a therapist, a specialist. And what I'm curious about bringing into the conversation a little more is perhaps just naming the key steps that this process of somatically excavating our bodies consists of. And let me just say that the steps that you have included in the protocol or the method of somatic archaeology and excavation are fundamental also in a lot of other somatic approaches and somatic modalities. So what are those steps that we go through in somatic archaeology that ground the process in the body and in the moment? What is the actual experience?
It follows a bottom-up neurophysiological process. It's the first step is I notice what's happening in my life. I notice the things that are offensive to me, the things that are challenging to me, the places where I find joy and relaxation, the things that stress me out. We're just noticing, where is pain, where, Then the next step is I sense. Where do I feel those things in my body? Okay. The next step is feel. When you stay with a sensation long enough, an emotion will emerge. But you have to sometimes ask questions of that sensation and explore it deeper than you possibly would. It's not a surface looking at it. It's really dropping into the feeling or into the sensation. Brings us into feeling. So we're going through all the layers of our brain, right? Notice I sense, I feel, our limbic system. I interpret, I reconcile. So the interpretation is once our body has delivered this information to our brain, we can start to make sense of it, not just based on what we've been told, but also validated by how we feel, right? And then the reconciliation is, who am I when I'm not carrying this pattern? Or who am I when I've unloaded my backpack? Who am I when I am free? And that's a question that we end every session with, because we want to engage the frontal lobes. We want to be able to visualize forward. Plus, it creates a completion. It brings us full circle. And I think, again, it's one thing to bring it up and process it, but it's another one to transform it and then be able to propel yourself into what's real for you. Because we all have a deeper personal soul story underneath this familial story that we've inherited.
Yes.
And so that's, it helps us to just be tight with ourselves. It helps us to identify who we are and what our purpose is. Because some people can live their entire life orbiting around what's wrong with them, orbiting around this family system that's dysfunctional and trying to fix it, and all of the relational things that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right that just in the same way that the body has the resources and the capacity to hold memory, to be the record keeper and the storyteller of our generational memory and our lineage, our past experiences, the body also holds the resource and the capacity to propel us forward, to help us reconcile and heal the limitations of the past. So I would say that the body, with its creative and its intuitive language, also aligned and harmonized with the resources of the earth, the cycles of nature, helps us to visualize and materialize, realize ourselves past the limitations of our familial systems. Dr. Ruby, I've really enjoyed this conversation, and to bring it to completion, I wonder if we could create a taste or an experience that could give a taste of what this somatic excavation work could be about, or where we begin. How do we begin feeling and sensing our bodies just enough so that we can orient towards that information held in the body that is calling our awareness to itself?
I'm just going to take a minute and preface it with something. My journey, personally, through this process has been quite amazing. And I really owe my health and my own sobriety and my own ability to vision and be proactive, as a trauma therapist. It's a very difficult field to be in with the work that I do. So this work has also helped me be really present to myself and what's going on, and it's opened up places inside of me that I didn't even know were there. So, there's always the surprise factor of we think we've dug it all up, and then there's more. And, it's like a flower blooming. You never quite know what it's going to look like. And in my life, there's been a lot of broken relationships in our ancestry. There was adoption and secrets and all sorts of things that muddied the waters. So it's never is, but for me, it certainly wasn't a straight line. And it's taken a good period of time to be able to feel like I'm really fully engaged in my body. And one of the practices that I did, because I felt fragmented by all of this confusion that preceded me, is I created this way of being able to integrate myself. And so I'm just going to share that with you. And I would like to just ask the people who are listening to close their eyes for a moment, if you're not driving. And one of the things that I do is I just take a couple of deep breaths and I feel my feet on the ground. I breathe into my bones, especially into my spine, and I let myself settle. Drop my shoulders. Take a few cleansing breaths. And then I imagine that right in the center of me is like a space, almost a magnetic space. Like the center of my body, center of my being. And I invite back to that place all the parts of me that may have gotten fragmented or may have gotten lost or may have been forgotten in this journey of life. And so I invite back into the center of myself all of my young parts and my adolescent parts, the wounded parts, the functional parts, the sacred parts. I invite back any part of me that's suffering or that feels like they have to be in isolation. And I ask all of those parts to stand side by side and to recognize each other. The infant parts, the spiritual parts, all of my wisdom. I invite the parts that belong to my heart, to my belly, to my womb. I invite them all back in so that they can stand with each other, they can witness each other, and recognize that we are one. We have one body that we all share. And that sometimes we have to separate out and fragment in order to experience this world and cope with stress. But for that few minutes, I give myself permission to come together so that I feel unified inside. Then I feel my feet on the ground, and I feel the heaven above me, and I know that I'm in alignment. As above, and so below. And here I stand, a child of the earth and a blessing of the heavens, prepared and integrated so that I can give the gifts that I'm bestowed for all of our relations. So I invite you to practice that any time of day, maybe before you go to sleep or to prepare yourself for the day. It's just simple things like that can help realign us.
Thank you so much for this deep practice and the deep wisdom that you've cultivated and you offer. Dr. Ruby Gibson, the author of My Body, My Earth, the Practice of Somatic Archaeology. You can find more about her work and another method she developed called generational brain spotting on her website, freedomlodge.org. And there also you can find the details of the workshops and trainings she offers. And you can also find this information in the notes to this episode on our website, embodiedway.com. Thank you for being with us today for this edition of the Embodied Way Podcast. To find more conversations, subscribe to the podcast, or to learn more about our guests, visit our website, embodiedway.com. If you'd like to learn more about my intuitive body and movement work with women in California, Europe, and online, please go to intuitiveness.org. I'm Stefana Serafina. See you next time.